Hey, good morning, folks. We're just trying to get the phone situated here. It's kind of freezing up on us. Is there anybody else online besides Lou, Michelle, and Harry?
Yeah, so it looks like we have Kim and Paige also from outside the organization with us.
If it's just like GNRC staff members, can we just dial into Teams?
Yeah.
As possible.
Going in football games.
All right. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Sounds like over there. So many times I think I'm on weekends doing other stuff, or I'm going here on Sunday. So. All right, we're good.
Yeah, good. It just seems like such a hassle nowadays. Build all that. It'll be interesting to see that game this weekend. That'll be a big game.
Yeah.
Kind of a must win. Oh, it's dark. Blue lighting. Yeah. I like to play in this good non-conference teams.
Yeah. Better game than last week. It'll be next weekend.
All right. Waiting to hammer that gavel. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties getting everything started this morning. We have that settled out now, and so I'd like to welcome everybody to the in-person meeting of the September Transportation Coordinating Committee. We have again, as normal, a hybrid online option for those who are not able to be here today. For our online participants, please communicate in the chat. Note that you may only hear the presenters clearly due to the acoustics of the room. Chat to help facilitate online participation. So for today, we only have one item to vote on, no other action items. That is the approval of the August meeting minutes. Do we have a motion to endorse the minutes?
Motion to approve the August 3rd, 2022.
Thank you, Bill. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. It is on the floor. Any comments, questions, or corrections? All right. Seeing none. All in favor of the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Now, we'll move to the second section of our agenda, the public comment portion. At this time, I'll open the floor to anyone wishing to make a comment to the Transportation Coordinating Committee. Please note that comments may also be emailed to comments@gnrc.org. Not seeing a rush to the podium. We have no public comments today. So moving on to the next item, there are no action items in section 3 of our agenda. Now we'll move on to section 4, which is the informational section of our agenda. And for this, we have item 4A, our presentation of the Tennessee Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment Plan. For this, I'd like to introduce Matt Meservey, the TDOT Long Range Planning Director. Matt?
Okay, can y'all hear me? Loud enough? Great. Thank you, everybody. Again, my name is Matt Meservey. I'm the Director of Long Range Planning here at TDOT. We've done this presentation, me and my partner with TDEC, probably 10 times, but she's not here today, so I will be stumbling through her section of the slide. And once we get to the heavy part, we will coast into that conversation. But I wanted to give everybody an update on where we're at. Is anybody familiar with the NEVI plan? Have you heard about NEVI and what that is? Okay, well, I'll give you a little bit of an intro on that. NEVI stands for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is funds that came out of the IIJA that are directed solely for the development and implementation of electric vehicle charging stations across the country. Before we go into that, I'll give you a little bit of some of the history of where we're at as far as EV implementation and adoption of that. So back in 2018, this is the stuff I'm going to start with, so please bear with me. But back in 2018, a group of agencies, TDOT, TDEC, TVA, a bunch of businesses, and other stakeholders got together to establish this goal of EV adoption. Currently, we're around, I guess the last quarter, we're somewhere in around 20,000 electric vehicles in the state. The goal for this entity, Drive Electric Tennessee, is to have 200,000 on the road by 2028. During this early process of DET, Drive Electric Tennessee, they put together a needs assessment that asked a bunch of questions across the state through surveys, in-person engagement, as well as input from subject matter experts, and came up with this fast charge TN network. This is the network that is used to help establish where along in the state and what corridors the most need for electric vehicle charging stations would be based on the demand, and also based on location. You can see in this map that it spans the entire state. It also crosses some of the areas of stress and at-risk counties to cover that state. It's a more cleaner version of that. The green, you see the difference in there? Basically, the green represents some of the alternative fuel corridors, the adopted alternative fuel corridors, which are mostly interstate facilities, and the blue are some of the more critical state routes across our state. Some of the early adoptions that we've had is an agreement with Rivian to put the automaker Rivian. I'm sure you see that type of vehicle on the road. They're becoming more and more prominent across the country with that unique headlight. That's a fully electric pickup. But Rivian had come to the TDEC and the state parks to enter into agreement to install chargers in all 56 of our state parks, and for free. So if you are in a state park with an electric vehicle, you're able to charge at this point free of charge. So we're fine for here. Again, most of this early incorporation was through the efforts of the Clean Fuels Coalition and the Drive Electric Tennessee. They've been putting a lot of effort into this long before NEVI came online. We can fly into, this is my part here. So TEVI, as I said, in part of the IIJA or the bipartisan infrastructure law, they provided a formula program of funds for all the states that were sub-allocated to every portion of the state to establish a much more robust electric vehicle station. Predominantly, these are we were calling it TEVI, so we changed the name to T and made it our own. But as part of TEVI, we are restricted to certain portions of the funding, to apply these funds. So hopefully this isn't confusing, but TEVI is restricted to just a portion of what the fast charge TN network is. And I'll get to that here in a minute. The plan goals, they're established in the fast charge CN network. We just applied that to your, for the ones that you can read. The idea is to look at a lot of the potential and make sure we also cover some of the risks of what EV deployment and operation. Cybersecurity is one of those. We have to make sure that people understand EV charging and what that means as far as pricing and some of the new terminology like kilowatt hour. That'll be something if you do start to own a vehicle, you'll have to learn. It's not dollars per gallon anymore, it's dollars per kilowatt hour, and how that translates to the equivalent price that everybody used to with gas power. Funding that came out of IIJA was about $4 billion statewide for the 5 years of the plan. Tennessee is receiving about $88 million of that for the 5 years. The first year is the only year that we've been allocated at this point, and that's 2017. The plan, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but the plan itself that we turned in will help unlock the first 2 years of the initial funding. So we're going to get somewhere in the realm of maybe $25 to $30 million that you're able to use for the first round of implementation. As I mentioned before, the eligible corridors, this is something that we had to do as part of an initiative to establish alternative fuel corridors. Alternative fuel corridors are more than just EV, it's compressed natural gas and a couple of other fuel types, but the only eligible routes for NEVI or TEVI are along these, what you see here is basically the double-digit interstates, minus I-55 in Memphis, and then 64 that travels between Memphis and Chattanooga along the southern border of Tennessee. All in all, it's about 1,500 miles. Some of the requirements, strict requirements of TEVI, is that it has to be a combined charging system type plug. I didn't get into the different types of plugs, but this is what establishes the DC fast chargers. These are the fastest charging plugs that you can have at this point, and it would take about somewhere between 20 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the vehicle that you have and whether or not the station charging apparatus has the ability to push that type of power for you. So it's, the time that you would need to charge varies, but you can also top off and move on to other stations. The idea is for this to establish a network that reduces range anxiety, but we try to go a little more positive and call it range confidence. It incorporates range confidence. So people that do own an electric vehicle don't feel like they're going to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. This establishes a way that you can travel the country or travel long distances without worrying that you're going to run out of charge. Basic requirements for this TEVI initiative or for NEVI is that the stations themselves cannot be any more than 50 miles apart along the corridor, and they cannot be more than 1 travel mile from the corridor itself. So they stay very tight close to that, so you're not having to drive all over the place to find these stations. The power requirement, as I mentioned before, you have to maintain a minimum of 4 chargers that can simultaneously charge 160 kilowatts at, if there were 4 vehicles at the same time. So you have to have a power requirement of about 600 kilowatts to make sure to be able to become eligible for these heavy funds. You can have more. It doesn't mean that you're restricted to 4, but you cannot have any less. So in areas, more urban areas, when you feel the demand for more chargers is there, that there will be an opportunity to build more through these funds if needed. We did do a pretty robust public engagement when we were working on this plan. We received notice in February of this year that these funds would be available and this plan would be due in 6 months. So August 1st was our date that we had to go from nothing to a plan that had to be turned in. Luckily, with the efforts that you just saw, we had a pretty good head start. So we were actually able to get this plan turned in 2 days before the deadline. Now we're waiting on approval because of the schedule I'll show here in a minute. But while we were putting this plan together, we spent the entire month of May trying to bring in comments. We felt, and this is a little bit different than what other DOTs did because they, other approaches that other DOTs did was to develop a plan and then send that out for public comment. we really thought that we wanted this to be planned for people. So we did the initial public involvement and collected a lot of the input and incorporated that into the plan. We knew we were gonna have time to go back and do 2 rounds of public meetings because of the time constraints that we had. So what you can see is that, we have social media blitz, we had pretty good engagements. We also did 9 in-person meetings across the state, and in each grand division, we did 3 of them. So Kingston, Kingsport, Knoxville, Nashville, Chattanooga, Memphis, Fayetteville, and Camden. So we had a mix of urban and rural. And by the way, Camden, first time I'd ever attended a meeting where behind us was a stuffed marlin. Not even stuffed, it was just a giant fish in our back. We were at a marina in Camden. It was actually one of the better attended in-person meetings. But we still have a website that is active. We're going to keep it active, and that's where we can, if anybody's interested, if you go to tn.gov/plan, you'll be able to see our draft plan up there. We had a pretty robust survey using MetroQuest. Again, within the month, we had about 1,000 responses from all but 4 counties in the state, so we have pretty good coverage of that. Some of the criteria that we want to use when it comes to site location and establishing site hosts for these is, based on the survey, we want to look at volumes, obviously points of interest and destinations, and whether or not these areas have the amenities for people to plug and, wait for their vehicle to charge. So similar to what you would do at a rest stop, you get your gas and you go in and buy some snacks in the bathroom. I do want to stress too that one of the requirements of these charging stations is that these all have to be in publicly accessible locations 24/7. They cannot be gated. They're not allowed to be restricted from any form of access if this is going to be through federal funding. We also want to make sure that we're future-proofing these charging stations too. So, for example, a lot of the charging stations that you may have seen out there now have curb-based, where you pull up to the curb and you plug in. As you all know, Rivian is making their life in here in Tennessee. There's going to be a need at some point for these things to be pulling trailers. And obviously, if you pull into a curb base with a trailer, it's going to be a lot harder to pull out. So we're looking at ways to incorporate pull-through type of spaces that obviously increase the footprint, which could increase the cost, but we do want to make sure that these are sustainable and they stay active and in operation for as long as they can. Some of the areas I mentioned, the 600 kilowatt requirement. Some of our local power companies do not have that ability yet, so there is some coordination that needs to be done to help work with them to, as part of these plans, help build up their infrastructure and maybe install some transformers that help them pull that 600 kilowatt power as we're looking at the criteria of where these locations would go. As I mentioned, the combination of medium and heavy-duty trucks, and then also as technology increases, maybe 150 kilowatts is going to be the minimum for what some of these new charging stations and their technology will offer. So, there's ability to bring in. There are some charging stations suppliers now that supply 350 kilowatt charging stations, but it's also restricted to the vehicle, so we can't take 350. It's that balance. But we need to make sure that we're looking into those things as we do that. Turning in that plan, though, was the easy part, because we have, that really was, again, just the minimum standards that we have to supply to unlock these funds. Once we get approval, we have the ability to start spending these funds. But we've got a lot of work to do up to this point to try to hone how we're going to implement these. So contracting, who we're going to contract with, what the contract areas are going to be, the criteria that we'll have to go into establishing a site. We're trying to establish now, we're working with the Clean Fuels Coalition through a grant, put that together. You can see over here on this left side, some of the other challenges that we can see coming. Buy America is another thing, everything. Even though we have received word that they're going to be lifting, or potentially lifting some of the Buy America restrictions, they're phasing, the phased out period of these restrictions is fairly quick. So we may not even have a chance to get in front of this in order to charging stations that could bypass the Buy supply chain and labor shortage is something that we also need to work on. Mentioned the timeline, so August 1st, we had to turn this in. We did it a couple days earlier. September 30th is when Federal Highway has the deadline for them to approve. We received one comment verbally at this point, and it was taken care of verbally, so we haven't heard anything since that turn. But while we're doing that, as I mentioned, we're looking at later this year to establish this procurement method to go through all the different ways that potential vendors would want to be utilized in these contracts, whether it's a team of specialized groups or whether the vendor themselves will become the contractee. That is yet to be as far, again, as the area that we want to do this. We talked about potentially breaking these into 4 regions or 3 grand divisions to try to make coordination and streamline it a little bit easier. But we've also heard from vendors too that have come to us to say that the quickest way to get these into the ground is to do individual applications. But I feel like that could take a lot of effort for everybody to try to coordinate. So again, we're working on that. By the end of the first quarter of next year, we should have everything in place and RFPs would go out, and hopefully by the 30th of June in the second quarter, we have procured our awardees, our contractees, and we'll start working on that. Anybody familiar with Justice 40? That's another initiative that's coming out for climate type initiatives from the White House. Is anybody familiar with Justice 40? Okay, well, you might be coming down the line because the federal funds are being used, especially for climate style funding. They've established a goal for us to make sure that we've covered at least 40% of the distressed and at-risk counties to make sure that they benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean that like a charging station, for example, in the TEVI program, will have to be built in one of these. It just has to benefit somebody who lives in that area. So it could be workforce development. It could be an operation and maintenance agreement with some of these locations. But they will be measuring us, and it's a little ambiguous on how we measure this. But the shaded areas are what's been identified as far as in the TEVI plan. What we would apply for Justice 40 in TEVI. We could probably provide more information on that when we get more guidance. So that's about it for this. This last slide here is just showing that we're not doing this alone. We're actively involved in the Southeast coordination group that they call REVI. This is just showing that when we hit state lines, we're making sure that we're coordinating with everybody else to make sure that 50-foot spacing makes sense, and we're not putting 2 charging stations right up against each other. That just happens across the state line. But this is something that's going to be actively happening from this point on. I think everybody's aware that the electric vehicle industry and the revolution is on its way. The wave is coming. The Super Bowl commercials, I think anytime you see Super Bowl commercials where every auto commercial was their electric vehicle vehicle, that the automakers are buying into this. They would spend that kind of money if they're just a flash in the pan. So,
Think I'll drive to Mississippi.
oh, over here, yeah.
Yeah, after
Yeah,
that, pretty much.
So, yeah,
That's a question about Interstate 55 and why it was left off.
well, 55 is, yeah, so, the designated corridors were established more for the alternative fuels. But as I said, TEVI is only eligible for those. Once we hit build out, again, once we've established the 50-foot spacing and the mile from each, the money left over can be used beyond the alternative fuel corridors. And I don't know if anybody really did the math, but I said 1,500 miles at 50-foot spacing is about 30 stations for the state. on the alternative fuel corridor. We're using about a $1.5 million price tag for these, and that's more of a pretty robust upgrade where we include some of the power upgrades for that. So that's about somewhere in the realm of $30 to $35 million out of the $88 million that we will be receiving. So we're anticipating that there will be money left over to expand to 55, maybe the future I-69, to some of the areas that will have potential moving forward. We didn't want to go too far into designating every corridor because that does put on a restriction that we have to get that built out. We're, like I said, we only are able to put the money towards the alternative fuel corridors until that build out is achieved. We have about 6 gaps along I-40 that I know for sure that are missing that 50-foot spacing. So we're working with the UT and the coalition, the fuels coalition that I talked about. 50 miles. Correct. Yeah, gap there. So there are 6 gaps from Memphis to 50 foot. Yeah, 50 foot. We may run out of money.
That's just between the pump.
50 miles. But yeah, the gaps need to be filled before we're able to move towards anything beyond that. You guys just had a bit of rest areas, also right off the interstate corridor, for instance? I guess, you may not be familiar, but rest areas are by federal law restricted from having anything that's a revenue generating entity. So unless somebody offers the charging stations for free, they cannot be put in rest areas. They're not concerned about it. when we start prospective contract awardees, they will have the criteria that, the minimum criteria that we want them to look at to locate the site. One of those criteria at the moment is not proximity to the substation.
Okay.
That will be up to the site host and the developer. Any other questions?
Who will be maintaining the station?
Part of the contract will include an operations and maintenance agreement. So whoever is awarded that site will be responsible for upkeep. Those are the 5 years. That's the plan. This plan will always be updated. This is not going to be a static plan. We'll definitely, when we get into when we're closer to build out, we will reassess how we're going to divvy up the rest of those funds, whatever's available.
Thinking through this at a local level, I see that, I guess, cities can be eligible. Is there any restrictions from it being a revenue generator?
The only restriction is that these are federal funds, so there is a cap on how much revenue you can generate from that. We're anticipating that this will be market driven, the rates that will be used, as you could probably guess. And the reason why I think it's a good idea to not look at these as single entities and look at more of a coordinated effort across the region is for that reason, is that you can offset your costs or maybe your drop in rural charging demand there with some of the more active urban areas that could provide a better rate at that point. So to me, that's one of the pros of having coordinated effort.
Are they only going to be fast charging, or are you going to have level 2 in those?
DC fast charge is for the initial build out. We believe that when we move beyond that, DC fast charging is not going to be the demand on some of those other corridors that we talked about. So we could go to level 2 chargers, which are a little bit longer, which are the ones you probably see all over right now in the park. They take a little bit longer. They're not meant for a quick pit stop style charge. It's more for the longer version. The Rivian chargers in the state parks are all level 2 chargers, so they are not DC fast chargers because the anticipation is that you're not going to the state park to do a quick fill up. You're there to enjoy your day at the state park, so you're not in any hurry at that point.
At each charging station that's going to be built, how many pumps or service items or whatever are there going to be at each station?
So the minimum is 4. You have to have 4 charging stations. Each of them there are vendors that have charging stations with dual sides, so maybe 2 that would supply 4 cords, essentially. But you can go higher. Again, if the demand is there, you can have that. What we're trying to do as far as a standard is we develop combinations of charging stations, whether they're a couple curved and a couple full through, whether they're all curved or all full through, because we want to give the applicant an idea as what kind of footprint will be required that would safely allow vehicles or trailers or anything like that to maneuver through that area without taking out one of those charging stations or a building.
So that is the 150 kilowatt, is that the fast DC charger?
Yes, everything is DC fast chargers.
I would think with the goal of 200,000 vehicles, electric vehicles on the roadside, will be able to pull out that gap. You're only having 4 pumps at each station.
As I mentioned, 30
Math in my mind doesn't.
as far as the timeline. What math are you talking about?
Just the amount of electrical.
Oh, for the incorporation? Yeah, well, keep in mind that now, the trend of EV growth is becoming more steeper. Last year, I believe, there was about a 6% growth in EV vehicle purchases. And as you all know, Tesla usually has the market pretty much wrapped around their finger until a lot of other auto companies started coming out with their versions. And some of them look pretty cool, I think. And I think some of that cool factor is gonna help put on there. They're not cheap. We still know that this is something that, cost is gonna create a problem with this kind of adoption, but there are, the used market is actually making them a little more affordable, and they're also providing more, types and models of electric vehicles. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, $7,500 now can be eligible for electric vehicles, get credit on that. So I know that the federal government is looking at ways to bring down these costs. I don't have. Does anybody have an electric vehicle?
Felix is the outlier.
Any insight?
I'm
Range
not
anxiety?
thinking about the maintenance, because that's a big state of mine,
Yeah.
driving to, station and be out of order, or never being repaired, or part of my question too, I think, was about the campaign, that's another one, people blocking or plugging their vehicles for, they've been there forever. Just kind of, deterrence, people from trying to do that, which is, I think that campaign to educate people about, how these work, what to do, educate, and things like that.
Agreed. And if you remember the education and outreach, which was the plan goal, because I think this is a new technology that we need to teach. I don't know if any of you have, are regulars on Facebook, but I get a couple of my high school buddies who are describing all over electric vehicles, because they feel like the cost, when they do the math of what it costs to do that, they're way off, and decided not to get involved in that kind of discussion. Use it as a way to educate and make sure that, I mean, it's really gonna be, I think a lot of people aren't really, they look at the charging station as their primary source of fuel, but in reality, it's their home. So you're filling up your vehicle using electric rates that are much less than what you see at the gas pump. Would you agree?
99% of my charging is at home.
Right.
By the way, I don't own a Tesla.
So now,
My largest concern is travel restriction with regard to remote traffic jams, weather events, things like that. And also just goes off.
well, I mean, what do you think, Felix? Yeah, your concern about being stranded in a rural area, I mean, did you travel long distances?
No, I just,
That range anxiety.
in town. I have a need to leave, and the fast charging is not the CCS, so they're spacing out the stuff that I was mine out, so. And it's mostly in town, and I do have range anxiety. It helps me plan my trips a lot better, a better driver because of that. And there's still, some good things to it. I'm worried about gas prices. But at the same time, how much I use my heater in the winter, or things like that, has an impact on the battery life or battery range. So yeah, it's a whole different, I have to get adjusted to it.
But do you think everybody will eventually have an electric vehicle for in town and still have their gas?
No, I don't. I feel like the technology, the battery technology that's coming is going to,
Offset?
I really do. I mean, the range now is, the Leaf is really one of the smaller batteries that doesn't have much of a range.
Like 350 miles?
300 to 400 miles are what some of these cars are now providing. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I didn't hack it up too much. I'll be better next time.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. I think it was a great discussion, great questions. So, moving along to item 4B of our agenda, this is a recap of the BPAC panel on bike ped funding opportunities. For that, I'm going to toss it over to Daniel.
All right, thank you, Andy. All right, good morning, everybody. So last week we had our it's turned into sort of a every other month bicycle and pedestrian advisory committee. I presented before on some safety research that we've done, but last week we had a panel on bike and pedestrian funding opportunities. We had Anna from here at GNRC, as well as Andy representing Mount Juliet, Sean Santaya from FHWA, Taylor Lee from local programs, and Anna Dearman from NDOT. This was the second in a sort of series of a panel talking about bike and pedestrian project delivery. This is, I guess, September 2021, we discussed some of the challenges associated with delivering bike and pedestrian projects. It's sort of been supplemental to our project delivery task force, talking about delivering bike ped projects specifically, as opposed to the overall project delivery conversation. So we talked about some of the challenges last year, and then this panel was focused on some of the solutions to and best practice strategies to funding bike and pedestrian projects. So in your packet, we provided a matrix. Really, the impetus for this matrix is to provide a resource for funding bike and pedestrian projects across all of the various state and federal sources. So you'll see some of them are state-funded sources like the Multimodal Access Grant, and then we also have our active transportation program on there, but then there's also TDOT's various programs, as well as some of the existing and new discretionary grant programs that have come through the IIJA. So on this, you'll see the amount of funding. Some of them are just the typical annual awards that go to our region. Some of them are the available funding nationwide, as well as other information about the grant, the timeline of the cycle, some example projects, an ideal usage column, sort of what the typical projects we've seen funded through each of these programs. But really in the panel, we focused on talking about example projects that have leveraged existing state and federal sources from some of our locals, such as Andy. And we really talked about some of the proven strategies to leverage these existing and state and federal sources. So I'll go through a few of those projects. So Andy talked about this, I think, in the last TCC or TPP meeting. The State Route 171 Mount Juliet Road bridge widening. This was an existing project that bike pedestrian accommodations were added to. It's about 3/4 of a mile bridge widening with a 5-foot protected bike lane, 6-foot sidewalk, raised median, and crossing improvements. I think the reason why Andy presented on this was mainly because it combined several federal sources. So we used our sub-allocated STBG, as well as because TDOT was involved in the project, also NHPP funds and a TAP award as well for construction, as well as a local commitment from City of Mount Juliet. But really, this project shows the advantages of incorporating bike and pedestrian facilities into a larger roadway project in order to leverage a larger pot of funds. Andy, I don't know if you want to say anything additional about this project.
I think that sums it up pretty well. I guess hindsight, I wish we would have gone a little bit wider on our sidewalks, but other than that, I'm pleased with the product. I've been seeing a lot of people running, walking over the bridge, not as many cyclists, but the increase in activity over the bridge, I think, has made it worthwhile.
Right. Thank you, Andy.
Hey, Andy, I got a question. Of the 7.2 million, how much TAP funds for construction were used in this?
It's been a minute since we went through that. I'm thinking it was around 1.5 million. I think it was, we did the application through the active transportation grant cycle several years ago through the NPO GNRC.
Another one is the City of Franklin's Harlansdale Farm multi-use path. This one is about a half-mile trail in park at Harlansdale Farm in Franklin. About a $2.6 million project, 10-foot multi-use path with a pedestrian bridge, lighting, and bike racks. This project is still being completed, but I think the key strategy for this was the preliminary phases were funded locally, which allowed the city to have more skin in the game, as well as the project coming from a prior planning project, the city's Greenway plan. So we've talked about in project delivery doing preliminary planning to understand the full funding needs of a project can help speed up project delivery and make the project more competitive for programs like TAP. So the project received TAP funds. I think about $2 million in TAP funds for its construction phase. Another one was the State Route 41 sidewalk and bike lane project in the city of White House. This was funded through our active transportation program here at GNRC. Believe all phases were funded by the active transportation program. $2.1 million project included multi-use path as well as separated bike lanes. This was there was prior planning put into this project, and it completed the city's Greenway loop. So a good example of leveraging GNRC's regional program as well as completing a connected network of bike ped facilities for the city. And then lastly, Metro Nashville's 12th Avenue South Complete and Green Streets project. This was a road diet and complete streets project on 12th Avenue South. It is still under construction, $6.4 million project, about a mile and a half. A lot of innovative bike and pedestrian accommodations, protected bike lanes, bioswales, sidewalks, streetscaping, crossing improvements. Reason we talked about this project was it's entirely funded locally. And I believe it was in the 2017 walking bike plan. Marty, you might want to correct me on that, but yeah. So really all of these projects are great examples of innovative ways to deliver bike and pedestrian projects to respond to the challenges that we've seen, project delays related to insufficient funding, for example. So I think some of the key takeaways between all of those projects are identifying a full picture of funding needs for projects, whether it's through a greenways plan or just a general transportation plan activity, increasing the use of local funding. Almost all of those projects had a significant local commitment that helped deliver the project and make it successful, as well as better leveraging existing state and federal funding sources, especially Andy's project having 3 different grant programs that helped fund the bike and pedestrian elements of the project. And then we also talked about some of the upcoming programs through the IIJA. There's a pretty significant commitment to bike and pedestrian improvements, whether it's through the increased TAP levels coming down from the feds or the standalone discretionary grant programs like the Safe Streets for All program. But I also want to mention one of the impetus for this panel was to emphasize that the MPO is a resource as well as all of the contacts for each of these grant programs. So the TAP office in local programs, the multimodal office at TDOT, and then obviously GNRC staff with the upcoming cycles. So TAP, I think the deadline is in first week of October, October 7th. Multimodal access has closed, but those applications are under review. And then I believe urban transportation planning grant, that cycle is coming up in October. Is that right, Jonathan?
More updates on that.
Okay. But I guess, just use the matrix to put together successful grant applications and figure out, ways to fully fund your bike pedestrian projects. And I don't know if you want to say more about, MPO as a resource.
Oh, you've already said everything pretty well, Daniel, but just a reminder to everyone, I think all of you hopefully know that we're here and available as a resource to you. Daniel worked really hard to create that beautiful matrix of bike ped related funding opportunities. If anybody wants to talk through a specific project with us or needs help digesting that matrix and try to look for what opportunities may best fit your project, please feel free to reach out to us. Always happy to help. We're definitely looking for increased opportunities to make those various funding sources work together, make the various agencies that hold the calls for projects that those funding sources are related to work together, and find better ways to get fully funded projects on the books rather than project needs that are hunting down pieces of funding here and there. Hopefully help churn those projects out faster and get things done more quickly. So just please feel free to reach out to us.
And take a look at the matrix and let me know, or let us know, if you have any suggestions or additions, maybe grant programs we aren't aware of, or other funding strategies that you'd use should be included in there. Andy, do you have any additional thoughts on the panel?
No, I think, I think what we've talked about a little bit on the panel was sometimes we talk about local funds versus the federal dollars. If you can scrape together a few different buckets of federal dollars for a larger project, by all means, go for it. Just remember, if you got one dime of federal money on it, it's a federal project. So if you're going to do that, make sure it's worth it. Balance the speed of what your local government is looking for. Find a dollar amount that you get comfortable with. As far as saying if it's below this, maybe I need to be looking at some local pots of funds that we can use for these projects. If it's above, then definitely, start looking elsewhere in the matrix and other alternate sources. Some of this, and don't even think necessarily about federal transportation. There's also some TDOT funds out there for trails and things. So there's other ways you can scrape together some money. But I think that was probably the biggest part of it, kind of that balance between local and federal, or state for that matter.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Any questions from anyone?
So with the funding opportunities, like the eligible elements of the sidewalk and multi-use path, does it also cover like the associated stormwater infrastructure?
It typically does.
Yeah.
Maybe Andy can probably speak best to that.
Yeah, that was one of the things for our bridge widening. As part of our grant application that we had, we knew we were already widening the bridge some. We really only marginally widened the bridge just a little bit more. But we took that extra width. We did account for some of the stormwater because, you got to have the curb and gutter. You can't have the stormwater interacting with the sidewalk especially. So we did, I'm thinking back, it's been a while, but we included a portion of the bridge, railing. We actually had specific railing for pedestrian for that, and we did also include the stormwater, curb and gutter too.
Marty, I think I know it was locally funded, but I know there was a pretty significant storm and drainage element to that project as well.
Yeah, without going into the details of how we got to it, we got to a great project.
Right. Any other questions?
All right. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Anna. So moving along into item 4C of our agenda, that is the recap of the Environmental Roundtable Workshop on Open Space Policies. For this item, I'll toss it over to Carson Cooper.
I just have one slide recapping the workshop that we had with the Environmental Roundtable. So we've been taking a deep dive into more land use policies and how they relate to the environment, because of course land use is so intertwined with transportation, and it's always chicken and egg on sprawl, like building a road or widening the road or adding facilities and how that affects the land use and therefore land consumption. So we've been diving into land conservation with the roundtable for a while. And we had a workshop where we were ranking different land use policies for their level of impact. So higher impact being more land conserved or higher quality of land conserved, and their ease of implementation. So researching the policy and writing it, as well as getting that leadership buy-in, public buy-in, and even as far as how hard it is to enforce the policy and maintain and manage the land after it's conserved. So it was a really interesting workshop. I think I highlighted a few of the kind of results that surprised me out of the workshop. So the roundtable members, of course, brought up enforcement. I think that, you know, maintenance of the land and changes in ownership are very hard to track when it comes to easements or greenbelt properties, or even just, you know, if you set your minimum lot size aggressively, someone can always go for rezoning. So there's kind of no perfect solution when it's thinking about all those different factors that can change the land and the demand. There was a perception that minimum lot sizes that are seen throughout our region are a little too low, and they may be encouraging sprawl, at least in certain 1 acre lot zones. There was some concern about that. Federal conservation programs are seen as a really great resource, but we're also seen as a pretty difficult incentive to pursue unless you have a lot of staff capacity to get through that federal red tape. So they said in their experience, usually it's kind of a larger nonprofit or hunting club that takes advantage of that, and less, you know, an interested landowner or a local government, which I thought was surprising. And then we talked a little bit about impact fees or mitigation fee programs, even some of those, you know, development stipulations that you put maybe in a planned development district. Some of those being really hard to implement, finding that balance of receiving sites or offset areas. It can be typically more of an administrative lift on staff rather than on the developer. So those are some takeaways that I thought were really interesting. In your packet, we've linked the Environmental Roundtable materials. You can see the poster results of those photos with stickers. And we've also adapted the workshop to a Survey Monkey. So I really encourage you to take the survey, rank the policies yourself. I think the roundtable has like a great outlook of being environmental experts, environmental advocates, but they're not planners. So I think that you all would have a very different outlook on maybe the implementation side of how difficult some of these things actually are. So I would really love to see your feedback. But just wanted to give an update.
Thanks, Carson. Any questions? Okay. All right. Seeing no questions, no action on this item. Next, we'll move into item 5 of our agenda. That is our reports. For the Federal Highway Report, Sean is absent today. Sean Santaya. Sean, did you have anything to add? Sean Falter.
I'll stand in for Sean Santaya and say they did complete their certification report for the Nashville area MPO, and we did get a successful certification report with no corrective actions. So I think he released it our meeting date last month at the end of the day, and so he didn't get to share the good news at our meeting, so I'll share that for him. I think the only other thing that he probably wanted to mention is the State Streets for All grant is due, I believe, a week from now, September 15th, I think it is. So if you're preparing an application, just be mindful of that date and let us know if you have any need for any data or guidance through that process. We're happy to help.
Thanks, Sean. Any other questions? Not that we can really answer, I guess, Federal Highway, but any other comments on that? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the TDOT report. I see Jonathan Russell over there. Jonathan?
Only thing I really have, the final 2023 resurfacing report that
no resurfacing projects. All that to say, I think I've updated you every month on our urban transportation planning grant. Finally, as of yesterday, those were sent to the consultant for signatures, and as soon as we get those back, we'll issue the suite, which could be as early as today, but I would look for that probably by the end of the week. And also that affects 3 communities in here, Nolensville, Thompson Station, and Franklin Street. So that's the only update I have.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any questions? Ironically, I was looking for the resurfacing list for 2023 yesterday. Couldn't find it, so I'll be looking for that. I had a question on a state route. So, anyway, no other questions on that. We'll move to the chair's report. I don't have anything additional to report for today. So next, we'll move on to the staff report. Sean?
All right, thank you, Chair. So one thing I wanted to mention, at the end of September, we'll have the GNRC annual meeting and luncheon. It'll be Wednesday, September 28th at 10:30. It'll be at Geodis Park, the new Nashville SC soccer stadium in the fairgrounds. And so looking forward to that. It'll be a great venue for those that haven't been there. The soccer stadium is pretty amazing. Probably better to go see a game there, but this is next best thing. I guess one other item that I wanted to, or two other items I want to mention. One is a couple of staff members and Andy, I know, was there as well, attended a presentation from TDOT staff on the project delivery network, which is kind of an enhancement to their project delivery process. And so there are some materials on the website that you can review. I can share the link for that, but I think that's something to keep in mind. TDOT's been doing a lot of work. You've heard the words of like integrated project delivery, and so this is one thing that is worth looking into as TDOT has kind of made some progress on this integrated project delivery, and this is the initial document that they're passing around. I know Andy was most interested in how that translates over to the local programs process. I think it's just for state projects for now, but hopefully in the future, carries over into the local programs development process. Last thing I wanted to mention, I guess really to turn it back to members is, I know we've had a couple of recent ribbon cuttings that we've kind of celebrated, but if there's any others that we've missed, I feel like I've been reading about some in the newspapers, but if anybody wanted to share some recent projects or upcoming projects that they've completed.
You can show our Albert Gallatin video again.
No, I don't have anything myself.
Okay. Well, keep on the lookout and send around anything if we come across it.
I think that's
All right.
All right. Thanks, Sean. One of the things I will mention about the project delivery network for TDOT, one of the things I heard was 5 years. That's very exciting. Having gone through the transportation reports, sometimes those can take 2-3 years themselves. So that process is greatly compacted. It's actually overlapping with some of the preliminary design, environmental. It's a monumental shift, honestly. And instead of a very linear approach to a lot of the projects that go through TDOT, it's more of a shotgun approach, as I like to call it. You still have a few milestones, but I think what was most impressive, just Google TDOT Project Delivery Network, TDN, and you'll find it. There's a flow chart. You've probably seen the old flow chart. I'm not talking about the local programs flow chart. I'm talking about the old actual design division that every single person in the design division has on their wall. That same flow chart is, which is like a 2x3 roll plot, plotted out. Now fits on an 11x17, and it's actually legible. So it's much smaller, much more compact. So I'm excited about that. But of course, I'm thinking from a local government perspective. I'm excited to see that once the kinks get worked out, maybe we can see that roll down to the local programs. I think it will. It's just a matter matter of time. So, but it was very exciting, to see that time frame, because we get used to longer time frames on those projects. So, anyway, before we adjourn, I'd like to open it to anyone else in here for any other business they'd like to bring before the board. Okay, seeing none, do we have a motion to adjourn? We have a motion, we are adjourned.
Sure.
I know
Yeah.
that is an easy